This is Chapter 33 of Pride and Prejudice, or Chapter 10 of Volume 2. Get ready for Colonel Fitzwilliam to spill some tea. More than once did Elizabeth, in her ramble within the park, unexpectedly meet Mr. Darcy. She felt all the perverseness of the mischance that should bring him where no one else was brought, and to prevent its ever happening again, took care to inform him at first that it was a favorite haunt of hers. How it could occur a second time, therefore, was very odd. Yet it did, and even the third. It seemed like wilful ill-nature, or voluntary penance. For on these occasions, it was not merely a few formal inquiries and an awkward pause and then away, but he actually thought it necessary to turn back and walk with her. He never said a great deal, nor did she give herself the trouble of talking or of listening much, but it struck her in the course of their third rencontre that he was asking some odd, unconnected questions about her pleasure in being at Hunsford, her love of solitary walks, and her opinion of Mr. and Mrs. Collins's happiness, and that in speaking of Rosings and her not perfectly understanding the house, he seemed to expect that whenever she came into Kent again, she would be staying there too. His words seemed to imply it. Could he have Colonel Fitzwilliam in his thoughts? She supposed, if he meant anything, he must mean an allusion to what might arise in that quarter. It distressed her a little, and she was quite glad to find herself at the gate in the Pales opposite the parsonage. So Elizabeth's walking nearby Charlotte and Mr. Collins' house, and she's walking around, and she runs into Mr. Darcy, and she makes sure to mention, hey, I walk here, so that they won't run into each other again. But he keeps coming to the walk because he doesn't want to avoid her. He wants to be where she is. She was engaged one day as she walked in reperusing Jane's last letter and dwelling on some passages which proved that Jane had not written in spirits, when instead of being again surprised by Mr. Darcy, she saw on looking up that Colonel Fitzwilliam was meeting her. Putting away the letter immediately and forcing a smile, she said, I did not know before that you ever walked this way. I have been making the tour of the park, he replied, as I generally do every year, and intend to close it with a call at the parsonage. Are you going much farther? No, I should have turned in a moment. And accordingly she did turn, and they walked towards the parsonage together. Do you certainly leave Kent on Saturday? Said she. Yes, if Darcy does not put it off again. But I am at his disposal. He arranges the business just as he pleases. Side note, Colonel Fitzwilliam says that Mr. Darcy put off leaving Lady Catherine de Bourgh again. So that means that there is one occasion where he said, oh, we're going to stay longer, and now a second time where he's saying they're going to stay longer. Probably because he likes Elizabeth. And if not able to please himself in the arrangement, he has at least great pleasure in the power of choice. I do not know anybody who seems more to enjoy the power of doing what he likes than Mr. Darcy. He likes to have his own way very well, replied Colonel Fitzwilliam, but so we all do. It is only that he has better means of having it than many others, because he is rich and many others are poor. I speak feelingly. A younger son, you know, must be inured to self-denial and dependence. Colonel Fitzwilliam is referring to primogeniture there, that he is, Colonel Fitzwilliam is a younger son, so he's used to not getting his way. Mr. Darcy as someone who is wealthy, important, well-respected, and also the oldest son, and therefore the heir to a large fortune, as we know, gets his way quite frequently. In my opinion, the younger son of an earl can know very little of either. Now seriously, what have you ever known of self-denial and dependence? When have you been prevented by want of money from going wherever you choose or procuring anything you had a fancy for? These are home questions, and perhaps I cannot say that I have experienced many hardships of that nature. But in matters of great weight I may suffer from the want of money. Younger sons cannot marry where they like. Unless where they like women of fortune, which I think they very often do. Our habits of expense make us too dependent, and there are not many in my rank of life who can afford to marry without some attention to money. So Elizabeth and Colonel Fitzwilliam are talking about the concept of marriage. Colonel Fitzwilliam is saying basically that younger sons can't marry where they like, and then Elizabeth kind of turns it into a more playful, joking thing and says, unless they marry rich ladies, which they usually do, and Colonel Fitzwilliam says, you know, we can't all afford, there are few who can afford to marry someone without some attention to money, so you usually have to take into mind some sort of monetary matters when you marry. Just as a little side note, the younger son issue is not just something from Regency England. It's very old. If you read any fairy tales, you have a lot of fairy tale protagonists who are younger sons or the youngest son. They're sort of the underdog characters because they're the least likely to inherit anything from their family. Just a little side note. Is this, thought Elizabeth, meant for me? And she colored at the idea, but recovering himself, said in a lively tone, "And pray, what is the usual price of an earl's younger son? Unless the elder brother is very sickly, I suppose you would not ask above £50,000. He answered her in the same style, and the subject dropped. So they kind of just joke about it, and then they move on from the subject. Elizabeth does wonder if he's talking about the fact that he maybe can't marry her because she's not as wealthy as someone else would be. It doesn't seem that she's interested in him because she's not, she seems more uncomfortable than flattered by this. She is good friends with him, though, still. He answered her in the same style, and the subject dropped. To interrupt a silence which might make him fancy her affected with what he had passed, she soon afterwards said, "I imagine your cousin brought you down with him chiefly for the sake of having somebody at his disposal. I wonder he does not marry to secure a lasting convenience of that kind, but perhaps his sister does as well for the present, and as she is under his sole care, he may do what he likes with her." "No," said Colonel Fitzwilliam, "that is an advantage which he must divide with me. I am joined with him in the guardianship of Miss Darcy." "Are you indeed? And pray what sort of a guardian do you make? Does your charge give you much trouble? Young ladies of her age are sometimes a little difficult to manage, and if she has a true Darcy spirit, she may like to have her own way." As she spoke, she observed him looking at her earnestly, and the manner in which he immediately asked her why she supposed Miss Darcy likely to give them any uneasiness convinced her that she had somehow or other got pretty near the truth. So Elizabeth asks, Elizabeth kind of jokes around and says, "Oh, Mr. Darcy brought you down here just so he could have you like at his side, at his disposal to kind of like help him along. I'm surprised he doesn't marry, so he could just secure a lasting convenience of that kind." So she's thinking, "Oh, Mr. Darcy should just get a wife so he could boss her around." Perhaps his sister is enough for now, as she's under his sole care and he may do what he likes with her, so maybe he can just boss around his sister Georgiana, and that's fine. She's just kind of like jibing, joking, and making little like jibes at Mr. Darcy. Colonel Fitzwilliam says, "Oh, I'm actually Georgiana Darcy's guardian also, so we have like joint guardianship of her." And then Elizabeth says, "Oh, does she give you any trouble? She's a young girl, and sometimes they get into trouble." And then he kind of reacts a little bit, not dramatically, but a little bit suspiciously, and he immediately says, "Oh, why do you think that? Why do you think she would give us trouble?" So Elizabeth's like, "Oh, she probably does cause some trouble." She directly replied, "You need not be frightened. I never heard any harm of her, and I dare say she's one of the most tractable creatures in the world. She's a very great favorite with some ladies of my acquaintance, Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley. I think I have heard you say that you know them. "I know them a little. Their brother is a pleasant, gentlemanlike man. He is a great friend of Darcy's." "Oh, yes," said Elizabeth dryly. "Mr. Darcy is uncommonly kind to Mr. Bingley, and takes a prodigious deal of care of him." "Care of him, yes. I really believe Darcy does take care of him in those points where he most wants care." So just kind of note that exchange of dialogue, that Elizabeth is very sarcastic when she's like, "Oh yeah, he's a great friend. I'm sure he takes great care of him and tells him what to do all the time." She suggests that last part. And then Colonel Fitzwilliam kind of picks up on that and is like, "Yes, he does. He does take great care of him and help him out. From something he told me in our journey hither, I have reason to think Bingley very much indebted to him. But I ought to beg his pardon, for I have no right to suppose that Bingley was the person meant. It was all conjecture." "What is it you mean?" "It is a circumstance which Darcy, of course, could not wish to be generally known, because if it were to get round to the lady's family, it would be an unpleasant thing." "You may depend upon my not mentioning it." "And remember that I have not much reason for supposing it to be Bingley. What he told me was merely this, that he congratulated himself on having lately saved a friend from the inconveniences of a most imprudent marriage, but without mentioning names or any other particulars. And I only suspect it to be Bingley from believing him the kind of young man to get into a scrape of that sort, and from knowing them to have been together the whole of last summer." "Did Mr. Darcy give you his reasons for this interference?" I understood that there were some very strong objections against the lady. And what arts did he use to separate them? He did not talk to me of his own art, said Fitzwilliam, smiling. He only told me what I have now told you. Elizabeth made no answer and walked on, her heart swelling with indignation. After watching her a little, Fitzwilliam asked her why she was so thoughtful. I am thinking of what you have been telling me, said she. Your cousin's conduct does not suit my feelings. Why was he to be the judge? You are rather disposed to call his interference officious? I do not see what right Mr. Darcy had to decide on the propriety of his friend's inclination, or why upon his own judgment alone he was to determine and direct in what manner that friend was to be happy. But, she continued, recollecting herself, as we know none of the particulars, it is not fair to condemn him. It is not to be supposed that there was much affection in the case. So, Colonel Fitzwilliam says that on the way to Rosings, Mr. Darcy said, I did a good thing. I saved a friend from making an imprudent marriage, an unwise, rash marriage. And he doesn't say who, but Colonel Fitzwilliam thinks that it's probably Mr. Bingley, because he was with Mr. Bingley the whole last summer. And that Mr. Bingley seems like the kind of guy who would let himself get, fooled by a woman, or whatever it may be. And then he says, I don't want to tell him, it's not really out in the open, because if this were to get back to the girl's family, it may not be good. He's talking most likely about Bingley and Jane, and he's talking about it to Elizabeth, who is her family. So we have some pretty intense dramatic irony going on here now. There's some sort of objections to the girl's family, which is also Elizabeth. We don't know how Mr. Darcy managed to separate Bingley from Jane exactly, but that's pretty bad. And of course, Colonel Fitzwilliam has no idea that Elizabeth is connected to this story at all. Elizabeth is very upset by this, and she says, I don't see why he had the right to do that. Then she kind of comes back to herself. She recollects herself and says, as we know none of the particulars, it is not fair to condemn him. It is not to be supposed that there was much affection in the case. That is not an unnatural surmise, said Fitzwilliam, but it is lessening the honor of my cousin's triumph very sadly. This was spoken jestingly, but it appeared to her so just a picture of Mr. Darcy that she would not trust herself with an answer, and therefore, abruptly changing the conversation, talked on in different matters till they reached the parsonage. There, shut into her own room, as soon as her visitor left them, she could think without interruption of all that she had heard. It was not to be supposed that any other people could be met than those with whom she was connected. There could not exist in the world two men over whom Mr. Darcy could have such boundless influence. That he had been concerned in the measures taken to separate Mr. Bingley and Jane, she had never doubted. But she had always attributed to Miss Bingley the principal design and arrangement of them. If his own vanity, however, did not mislead him, he was the cause, his pride and caprice were the cause, of all that Jane had suffered and still continued to suffer. He had ruined for a while every hope of happiness for the most affectionate, generous heart in the world, and no one could say how lasting an evil he might have inflicted. So Elizabeth is now getting really upset and really frustrated. She thought that Caroline Bingley really separated them, but now she knows that it's Mr. Darcy's actions more than anything. And she's furious because he's ruined basically Jane's happiness, at least for a little while, and maybe forever. Maybe there's lasting damage to this. There were some very strong objections against the lady, were Colonel Fitzwilliam's words, and these strong objections probably were her having one uncle who was a county attorney and another who was in business in London. I may have spoiled a mild thing. So the objections are to the lady, so probably to Jane, and Elizabeth thinks that those objections are based on the family, and not so much the behavior of the family, but just their social class and standing, that they have people in their family who earned their own living instead of inheriting money. To Jane herself, she exclaimed, there could be no possibility of objection, all loveliness and goodness as she is, her understanding excellent, her mind improved, and her manners captivating. Neither could anything be urged against my father, who, though with some peculiarities, has abilities which Mr. Darcy himself need not disdain, and respectability which he will probably never reach. When she thought of her mother, indeed, her confidence gave way a little, but she would not allow that any objections there had material weight with Mr. Darcy, whose pride she was convinced would receive a deeper wound from the want of importance in his friends' connections than from their want of sense. And she was quite decided at last that he had been partly governed by this worst kind of pride, and partly by the wish of retaining Mr. Bingley for his sister. So Elizabeth decides that Mr. Darcy's motives were probably pride, more about the status of who Mr. Bingley would marry than the character of that person or their family, and that his other motive is he may want Mr. Bingley to marry his sister Georgiana. The agitation and tears which the subject occasioned brought on a headache, and it grew so much worse towards the evening that, added to her unwillingness to see Mr. Darcy, it determined her not to attend her cousins to Rosings, where they were engaged to drink tea. Mr. Collins, seeing that she was really unwell, did not press her. Mrs. Collins, seeing that she was really unwell, did not press her to go, and as much as possible prevented her husband from pressing her. But Mr. Collins could not conceal his apprehension of Lady Catherine's being rather displeased by her staying at home. So Elizabeth is really upset with this because she knows that this has seriously ruined Jane's happiness. Now she has a person to put the blame to. She doesn't want to see Mr. Darcy, so she stays home. Mr. Collins is a little bit worried that Lady Catherine will be displeased, but Charlotte sticks up for her friend and lets her stay back. So that is chapter 33 of Pride and Prejudice.